eyes. But the history of the Espionage Act, oi, you know, and I didn't know this until I read about it. The Espionage Act was last used during the drumbeat running up to the Great War, the First World War. And it was used to round up people like us, again, critics, anti-war activists, journalists, people who were fighting child labor without warrants, mass arrests, people were beaten, and Eugene Debs got a 10-year sentence under the Espionage Act for giving a speech about the Constitution. And the Espionage Act arrests quieted dissent in this country for a decade. So it is not a happy thing, the invocation of the Espionage Act against Bill Keller. And, you know, there are other examples of horrible things happening to journalists. Greg Palast, who wrote Armed Madhouse, was investigated by Homeland Security. And staffers for Associated Press and CBS have actually been seized in Iraq because the US didn't like the images and stories they were producing. And, you know, they were held without charges in abusive US-held prisons. So it's very bad. And the last two things you do in a fascist shift when you're closing down an open society, I mentioned you recast criticism as espionage and dissent as treason. Remember, Hillary Clinton was called a traitor for criticizing the deployment of the war. And the last thing that happens is that you subvert the rule of law or simply declare martial law. And in the run-up to the election, you know, according to the historical blueprint, the months before an election are a very unstable time, most likely to see acts of provocation, hyped threats, destabilizing scenes where, like, there'll be a protest and agents provocateurs will provoke violence or engage in violence to give an excuse for a crackdown. But more sort of routinely, at the end of my argument, I play out a series of what-ifs for this last point in the classic fascist shift, which, God willing, we're not going to get to, because we're all going to rise up right now and save the country. We are. But what is more likely to happen is something more subtle. Remember the US attorney scandal? Okay, so when I first heard about it, I was reading Goebbels. He was so brilliant. And, you know, I said I bet those attorneys were in swing states. And it's not that I'm that smart, it's that I know the blueprint. And in fact, they were in swing states, and in fact, the emails that the White House is not turning over to Congress will show that one of the scenarios they were playing around with was firing all of the US attorneys all at once in a kind of mass purge, Night of the Long Knives. So had they done that, and they would have gotten away with it if a blogger hadn't sounded the alarm, we would already be looking at the end of America, because the US attorneys decide to prosecute voting rights groups, for instance, in a close election. If your cronies are the ones making the decisions, it's pretty much over, even without a coup, a violent coup. And we have this, like, wrong notion of what a closed society looks like. A closed society doesn't look like marching, goose-stepping columns or crematoria in the distance. It almost never looks like that. Once in history it looked like that. A closed society, even a violent military dictatorship, really has a lot of the trappings of civil society. There are still elections, they're just corrupted. Tyrants love holding elections. It validates them. Hitler held elections. 99% of the Austrians voted ja to their own annexation because there were brown shirts outside the voting booth menacing the people who were counting the vote. Do you guys remember the reports of Republican staffers, young men dressed identically, menacing people counting the vote in Florida? There are still elections in a closed society. They're just corrupted. There's a changing of the guard. It's just, and Giuliani is clearly the designated successor. But it's the same cabal in power, essentially. There's still a judiciary in a closed society. They're just not free to adjudicate freely and go against the regime. There's still academics. They're just watching what they say. There's still newspapers. You just know exactly how far to push an inquiry. So at the end of this scenario, there are a series of what-ifs that are very plausible to close down our society further leading up to the election. So now I've completely bummed you out. So now I'm going to shift to what we can do and what we have to do. I mean, this is a really important moment because the window is closing. But history shows that at a moment like this, if millions of people wake up in time and push back, they can push democracy forward and unseat tyrants. And there are amazing, inspirational stories that are evidence of this in the democracy movements that brought down the Berlin Wall, people power in the Philippines. All over the world, when millions of people push back, they can unseat tyrants, especially in a weakened democracy like ours that is still not closed. But it takes a democracy movement right now. We have no time to waste. It takes millions of people rising up and insisting on restoring the rule of law. Now, when I first started talking about these issues, I thought we could do it legislatively alone. And a few other leaders, or a few leaders and myself, started what is called the American Freedom Campaign, which is a grassroots democracy movement aimed at confronting these abuses and restoring democracy in time to save us. And we started out with nothing, and now we have almost 5 million members in our various partner organizations. And we're aiming at 10 or 20 million. And we got commitments from all the candidates to restore the Constitution. All the candidates on the Democratic side, Hillary and Obama, were the last holdouts, but they just signed or gave language. And now we're going to the Republicans. Only Ron Paul has signed right now. Yeah, I know. But this is not enough, I now realize. The violence is escalating. You know, the thing about a fascist shift is that when people start to wake up, that's when they start to crack down harder. And I'm very worried about these reports of massacres in Iraq. Very, very worried, reading today that the State Department is protecting Blackwater in Iraq from being investigated. And I'm very worried about these tasering scenes and scenes of people being pepper sprayed and scenes of women being dragged away in the Phoenix airport that keep showing up on AOL in eerily good video. Because, you know, again, National Socialists created a lot of footage of atrocities early on to freak people out and intimidate them. So what I'm saying is we need to ratchet up our efforts even as they ratchet up the violence or the suppression.